my ad, and it tests their IPv6 capability. Hey, here's a URL. You can only reach it in v6. Can you reach it? We see most of the internet almost all of the time. And so when I say that right now, around 40% of the internet's user base can get to an IPv6 URL, it's true. That really is where we are. But look at the previous 10 years. I'm like, that's hardly an up and to the right kind of curve. It's kind of linear. And by the awesome power of mathematics, remember that? And a few differential equations, then you can extrapolate this and come up with the fact that if we continue the rate we're going, this V6 transition has got another 20 years to run. I'm like, seriously? Now, I don't know how many of you were around in 1990. Looking around the room, I'm not sure I see many others. There might have been a couple. V4 had just taken off. The internet was going gangbusters. Everything was accelerated. Everything was fast. And when we developed V6, we thought naively that, oh, it's a tiny internet. It'll take about 5 years to ring out V6. Easy. 10 years, nah, too long. 5 years will be fine. So we thought it'll be pretty quick. It'll just happen. But that was then, and this is now. We're now 2025. We're deep into this transition and we're still only at 40% of the user base. What went wrong? What was wrong with the way we tried to attack this problem? There is no doubt we started as early as we could. This is a slide pack. Remember when we used to take foil acetates and use overhead projectors? Well, someone took a picture of a couple of them, and this date from 1990 from Frank Zielinski, who'd done his, got out the ruler and the pencil and, did it all carefully, including handwritten slides, and worked out that we were going to run out of V4 addresses in about 18 months. We knew this in 1990. We knew we had a problem, and we started to attack the problem as soon as we could. By 1992, the IETF had started the routing and addressing problem, the road group, to try and figure out how to get over. The internet had hardly started, and we're about to crash into some big walls. And by 1994, just 4 years after the first alarm bell had started to ring, we'd actually got consensus on what to do. None of you better not be, use class A, B, C addresses in V4. That's just old stuff. These days, everything is classless, and that gave us a huge amount of breathing space. So unstructured sublinks saved our bacon at the time, and the other part was a successor protocol. V4 was not going to cut it. It was really obvious even then it wasn't. So we came up with IPv6. I love this photo. I think it's Russian. And I can't, every time I look at it, I can't figure out how it could ever turn a corner. I'm not turning, I'm going straight ahead. Doesn't matter where the rails are, I'm going too fast. Brilliant. Bizarrely, IPv6 was the minimal change of all of the successor protocols that we were talking about. Absolutely minimal. It first came out saying, oh, I just recompiled it and I changed the number 30 to 128 and it kind of worked. Yay! And that was really where V6 was, just absolutely minimal. It removed packet fragmentation on the fly. We thought we were doing the right thing. That was a mistake. And we replaced ARP with multicast because Steve Deering had just done his PhD in multicast. No deep reason, that was it. But it was an end-to-end protocol. You couldn't put in relays, you couldn't put in translators. It wasn't backward compatible with V4. It was a new language. Everyone had to change. And so we came up with this model of what we called the dual stack transition. Now, we'd done this before when we finally got rid of DECnet. We'd even done it a bit with AppleTalk, I guess, where you just slide in a second protocol, and the more you use the new one, the less the old one gets used. It naturally dies at some point. And as long as applications prefer to use the new one, you don't need to do anything. It just self-manages. So this idea of dual stack was how we coped with the fact that flag days for the network were just not possible. That was a 1980s thing. Could never be done ever again. Tomorrow we're all running V6. Yeah, right. So the idea was it would just look after itself. Fantastic. Nothing like a problem that looks after itself. You can then ignore it. So we did. We did for many, many, many years. The transition was just going to happen, so we didn't need to worry. So we went on and started to do other things. We didn't need to think about it until I blame Apple. The iPhone was revolutionary because it was bad enough having a PC in everyone's house, but that's only a few 100 million, a billion or so. But the iPhone was one in everybody's pocket. All of a sudden, the numbers got astronomically big, astronomically quickly. This was affordable mass market technology, and it completely blew our plans right through the roof. In the second last year of V4, 2009, the regional internet registries got rid of, sent out the door 190 million addresses. Don't forget, there's only 4 billion there. So we're chewing through just under, 10% in 1 year. The next year, full 10%, 248 million addresses churned out the door. Don't anyone mention the word panic, but, it was sitting there. All of a sudden, this stuff was getting to be a real problem. So the automatic plan we had of this wonderful takeoff, that by and of itself, V6 would get naturally preferred. As the internet grew, the amount of V6 would grow even faster, and it would all happen without ever having to reach down into the bag and get the last V4 address. And we didn't need to do a thing. It was all just going to happen. Until someone dropped the ball. All of us dropped the ball. We weren't looking, and we had no ability to control this. We were meant to actually have V6 running before we got to the last V4 address. In actual fact, in 2011, the opposite happened. We ran out of V4 with a crunch. We hit it running at full speed. The last year, we got rid of 330 million V4 addresses out the door, the biggest year ever, right up until there was no more. So all of a sudden, we had no transition plan anymore. We had no gradual way of doing this. No matter what we did, it was going to be a mess. Couldn't turn off the internet, couldn't tell everyone to stop using it. The telephone is your friend, lift up that handset and start dialing, dudes. No, couldn't do that. And the answer, of course, as distasteful as it was to some of the more zealotry folk in the IETF, the answer was network address translation. Because if you haven't got enough to go around, share. And NATs were actually brilliant for this. So what we actually did was time share across users and share across the port numbers. All of a sudden, it wasn't a 32-bit address space, it was a 48-bit address space, because those 16 bits of port address came in bloody useful. So all of a sudden, a low friction approach. You can run NATs, I don't have to. You can run them, I don't have to. It can be done in a piecemeal, uncoordinated fashion. It matched the internet, remarkably well. And if you're a client at home, you don't need an IP address, you just talk to servers. It's only servers who needed addresses. They were the only points of the rendezvous. So despite the distaste, it matched the economic model of the internet at the time. We had shifted from a 1980s model of mainframe peer-to-peer. You're all too young. You don't remember this shit, do you? We had big mainframes. They did everything. So they talked to each other as peers, okay? All of a sudden, when you started doing devices on your desk, on phones and so on, those were little machines. They weren't service hosts. They were just simply clients. So we divided the network into servers and clients, and NAT suited that brilliantly. So the implication was that all of a sudden, it really didn't matter that much. Now, the RIRs had lost control because the RIRs exercised control through their policies of address allocation. But when you've got nothing more to hand out, you have no more control. And actually what happened was a market came up in its place. And that process, a market-driven process, took the place of the RIR's address allocation policies. And market pricing was the barometer for scarcity. And quite frankly, What had happened was, predictably, the largest players got to dominate. The content distribution network players, the Amazons of this world, the Alibabas these days, Google, Apple, etc., that ran big content factories, dominated this area. They could afford it. Servers were rich. Clients didn't need addresses. No great problem. So why do I need to move to V6? This is a map, or at least a graph, of a time series in North America, US and Canada, basically. And it shows the population of users who could reach something in V6 only, the V6 proportion. And it climbed to 50% just at the start of COVID, start of 2020, and didn't move since. The players in North America who have done V6 are fine. The players who haven't are fine. And those who haven't don't seem to be under any particular pressure to move. They've reached an equilibrium point without any impetus to get off it. Wow. Well, address scarcity has now changed. You don't need public addresses for clients, you just need it for servers, and even then, you don't need it for every service. How many domain names can I put on one server? I don't know. Some folks say 1 million, some say 10. It really doesn't matter. It's just a virtualization of the service world. So all of a sudden, we're now looking at names, not addresses, and we're able to scale in a different dimension using the namespace. Address scarcity was not a problem. The original price of addresses when they started to get traded a little over 10 years ago was about $11, $15 an address. It moved up to 30 slowly. During COVID, everyone going, and it climbed up to 60. Guess what? It's back down at $40 bucks an address again. There's no pressure out there for scarcity. Address scarcity isn't really a factor in today's industry. Why not? What is the world we are living in? And I would actually contend that it's a world not of scarcity and rationing, but a world of abundance, a world of phenomenal abundance, where we used price distribution as a way of moderating demand for a scarce resource, but quite frankly, is computing scarce? Wow. I'm in a world of 2-micron track silicon chips. I'm in a world where we are really putting 1 trillion gates on a chip. I'm in a world where this is a supercomputer. There is no scarcity of compute out there still. Moore's law is prodigious in the way it delivers capacity inexorably, both in fiber capacity by having better digital signal processors and in just raw capacity on the processing chips. Compute power, up and to the right. We keep on delivering. Oh, I can't make it faster anymore. Fine, just put more processors on the one chip. 30, 100, 300. Just keep on adding. So compute power isn't scarce, it's abundant. And if you look at the price of storage, that's a log scale. That's a log scale and it's still going down dramatically. Storage is not just cheap, it's giveaway. So the world we live in is not a world that needs rationing. It's not a world that demands price-based rationing. It's a world of phenomenal abundance. What did we do with that? We changed the way the networked world works. Instead of going over to where the resource is and dragging a copy back, we use that abundance to deliver a copy close to every user. We changed from on-demand to a provisioning model of just in case. Netflix has its entire catalog right beside you in the local data center. You're not going to watch it all, you'd be crazy. But just in case you do, it's there waiting and it's really fast because they've pre-configured and preloaded the network. The service model for provisioning takes account of that abundance and delivers just in case you might want it. So now, how wide is the network? I live in Canberra in Australia, a tiny little country town, it's not that big. It does have 2 data centers, yay. I'd actually be amazed if many of my packets go further than those data centers. Most of my traffic is delivered locally. It's a shorter network. In fact, it's hard to actually say it's a network at all. It's just one hop. What does short actually mean? Well, distance is the killer. Latency and distance is what makes networks creak and groan. You'd know this if you've ever done any work, in this kind of long latency networking. It's a pain. If I can reduce that to the width of a data center, all of a sudden I'm flying at terabits per second. Because of short latency, the stuff just flies. All of a sudden, server and content aggregation works because the network itself is a smaller network. So we serve content from the edge. We don't serve it across the network. What does short mean? Short means fast. You've never had it so fast. Why? Because most of the packets aren't going very far. There is no networking. It's just switching. The new BGP, routing dudes, is the DNS. BGP doesn't matter. Stuff doesn't go over long distances anymore. It's simply a last mile delivery problem. Packet miles has shrunk, which means the network now can operate at gigabit speeds. And we're now talking trunks inside the data centers of up to a terabit because we can do this across short distance. So faster is the other byproduct. And now we've got ample compute power at the edge, phenomenal compute power at the edge. We can contemplate encrypted protocols everywhere, all of the time, even in my watch. And my watch isn't groaning under the load. There is enough processing power to do this. So all of a sudden, quick, encrypt everything all of the time is a serious option. TLS 1.3, a serious option. And now we're talking even deeper into encryption with oblivious DNS and oblivious HTTP to actually hide the identity of the end parties from each other. How can you do this? Because the edges are capable. You've got so much compute power now, you can do this and get away with it because the cost is marginal because compute is abundant. What does that mean? It's cheaper than you've ever seen this. This is abundance and cheapness on a scale that we've never seen before. So how do we make the network 1 billion times bigger than it was in 1980 or 1990? Because we made it shorter, faster, cheaper. We scaled. We didn't scale addressing. We scaled in the naming space. And that's what gave us the clue here. The result is economic. In the 1990s, we were still living the legacy of the telephone world. The local telecommunications company owned all the money and orchestrated the entire industry. They were the folk that pulled it all together. That's gone. What's the richest company in the world today? I believe it's Apple, and if it isn't, it's Microsoft. Google's not far behind it, and so on and so forth. The money, and massive amounts of money that we've never seen to such levels of aggregation, is at the application area. All that abundance is actually shifted with all that value as well. The network is economically trivial. It doesn't matter. What matters is, if you will, the application economy. So who pays? I run a network. I need a lot of money because I'm going to spend it all on V6, buying new routers and new staff and new this and new that. Your customer's going to pay you 1 cent more for running V6? Nope. We did our job so well that that change from V4 to V6 running dual stack is invisible to them. Why would they pay you more money? And if you're an applications person, will you pay more to have your application run on a V6 network? Of course you won't. So no one is willing to pay for the network to undertake a transition. The currency of networks is no longer address-based. IP addresses aren't the central part of the argument here. Today's network is a named network. Everything centers around the security of names and TLS. Everything. We are running a name-based network. The DNS is now the closest match. The DNS is now the switching service. All the large CDNs run BGP as a switching service. The average AS path length in a large CDN is about 1. It's adjacent to everyone, or it's not doing its job well. All of a sudden, there is no network. There's no demand for networking engineers because we don't network. It was too expensive. It didn't actually solve the problem. What solved the problem was taking advantage of abundance and replicating everything. So let me repeat that. Most large CDNs run a BGP routing table with an average AS path length of 1. It doesn't route. Routing security is very important. Well, not really, because there's no routing. DNS security is very important. Yes, it is. It's amazingly important. And we rely on TLS as if our life depended on it, because it does. Names are important, and the DNS is important. And almost all the traffic we do now is switched, not routed, and it's based around steering by name, not steering by address. That is a massive change, and it's happened in your lifetime as well as mine. We've moved completely and deserted end-to-end networks. We've gone even away from client-server into this model of CDN-based switching, where we take aggregated platforms of services and deliver it across that last mile hop. Clients are identified at the application level, not at the IP level, and services are DNS name services. The 1980s architecture of addressing was a 1980s architecture. V4 or V6, it's still a 1980s architecture. The architecture we are using to scale today's network, to actually produce a network with billions of users and tens, if not hundreds of billions of devices, is oddly enough a name-based architecture that uses addresses merely to stop the packets colliding with each other. They're ephemeral tokens of distinguishing and nothing more. So why is V6 taking so long? Not because you're stupid. It's not because you're short of money. None of that. Because it doesn't matter. It's not part of your critical path in running a digital service. Something else is going on. Because quite frankly, IPv6 is not going to solve the problem here. We have to take this and turn it into a different kind of network, a network that is based around naming systems. So names matter. Names really matter. Where's Kurt Lindquist when you need him? The DNS really matters. Addresses, not so much. Address-based routing, not so much. It's a different kind of world we're living in now. And it's a world based around the side effects of abundance and the inexorable pressures of technology change with Moore's law and the shift of economics out of the network into applications that have caused this change. So does anyone care about V6? Yes, you care. It's a wonderful area to look at. But does it really matter? For those 60% of the world that sit behind networks that don't do V6, I don't think they live second-class lives. I don't think it really matters to them. They still see the same service world as everything else. So in essence, what we did, it was, I suppose, more rational to change the entire architecture of the network than it was to do a transition to V6. And that's the reality we're living in today. Thank you. The clock staring at me says I've got precisely 5 minutes and 40 seconds if there's anyone with questions. Run to the microphone.
Okay. Cool, thanks. I'm Andrew from Indonesia. One question. The fact that seems that IPv6 is no longer needed. It's basically now address space. So the first question is, what's next? You presented the facts, but what next? The second question is, I see that some of the RIR, they still have the waiting list. That means the demands for the IPv4 still there, even though now the name rather than address is much more important. But why waiting list still there? Thank you.
Okay, so what was the first question again?
What next? I mean, you present
What
the
next?
facts.
Okay.
You present the facts.
Moore's law is so bloody hard. Moore's law, when the number of gates on a chip doubles every 2 years, every piece of equipment you bought this year, in 2 years' time, is junk. Because your competitors who bought later have a much more efficient, much faster, much whatever it is piece of equipment. Moore's law has driven this industry into strange and exotic places. No business model can survive. Why do folk like Google get really big? It's not because they're cleverer than everyone else, but the only response to this kind of inexorable pressure was to buy everyone else around who could look like they might be a threat. So we have no idea about the next 5 years. Not Google, not Apple, not me, not you. Moore's law is really tough. And where this gets expressed in technology, I don't know and you don't know. So no betting on that. The second one, why do folks still queue up for free IPv4 addresses from the RIRs? Because they're free. Realistically, look at the trading price. Hilco, the IPv4 folk out there, publish pricing data. I adhere to current models of market-based scarcity. If a resource is scarce and under contention, the price goes up to reflect that scarcity. If a resource is in abundance, the price goes down. Last 3 years, the price has come down, not going up. So yes, folk queue up for free, I'd queue up for free, and so will you. But the market is saying, don't really value it that much. It doesn't seem to have a scarcity premium, don't really care. And what it really says is the folk who have V6 are quite happy. Nothing wrong with what they're doing. They're not going to get rid of their dual stack network. It works. But the folk who don't feel under any pressure to change their platform. And so we're in this sort of weird stasis where a little under half do V6, a little over half don't, and no one really wants to move. We could be here for decades. And the issue is where I'm getting to is, I don't think it matters. I really don't think it matters. This is no longer an address-based network. Get over it.
Jeff, there is a question from the chat.
Yep.
It's from Anupam. If DNS matters, then what's stopping large-scale adoption of DNSSEC?
Because DNSSEC only solved half the problem and solved it badly. It doesn't really matter what answer you get from the DNS. What matters is that the packet I send to that server is the right server. The server needs to prove its identity. When this problem was first recognized in 1994, there were two efforts that started. The academics who proliferated at the IETF at the time said, we need security for the DNS. We need to make sure that folk can't impose lies in the DNS. Let's start working on this phenomenally complex protocol, one that causes more outages than there are success. So the answer I get from the DNS is now true. So I go to that address. Is that the right service? I don't know. I have no clue. It could be a routing attack. Anything could have happened. At the same time, when Netscape was still a thing and Jim Clark was running it, they attacked the problem differently. And they said, how do I know that the service I'm going to, where I'm sending my packets, is the real deal? What's the real deal? Oh, tough question. Why don't we say, if I can prove that you own the name of the service you purport to be, I'll trust you. Domain name certificates. TLS solved the whole problem. And oddly enough, it didn't matter if you got rubbish from the DNS or not. If I can get the other end to prove that it is the service I want, I'm done. I'm home. I'm finished. The world runs on TLS. Thank God it doesn't run on DNSSEC. And you should all feel grateful for that, said he, jabbing the knife into DNSSEC. I'm going to pay for this sometime. No other questions?
No. Thanks, Jeff.
22 seconds left. I did it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Next, we have Mark Tinker, who is the co-founder and managing director of Transmission Co. And he brings a great talk about critical submarine cable system and how its all components works together. So off to you, Mark.
Thanks, Drew. Hi, everyone. This is just a primer on subsea components. So obviously, as with the internet in this room, that's traveling across a submarine cable outside of Malaysia and to the rest of the world. And as Jeff has demonstrated, the way the world is interconnected, many of the engineers in the IP space aren't really familiar with subsea component infrastructure. And so this is really just a primer to just tell you about how that is put together. So the essential components of the subsea space is you've got a wet plant and a dry plant. Obviously, the wet plant is anything that touches the sea, and the dry plant is anything that was obviously on the terrestrial ground. The wet plant will include obviously the cable itself. It will include the repeaters. It will also include the branching units, and we'll get into all of this shortly. The dry plant will include what is known as a beach manhole, a cable landing station, power feeding equipment, and the submarine line terminating equipment. So we'll get into all these in a bit more detail. So the physical cable itself, which is part of the wet plant, is a highly protected system that contains both the conductor, which is either made of copper or recently now made of aluminum, that carries the electrical signal, electrical power and current down the system to power the amplifiers. It can be buried as deep as 9,000 meters, and it's normally thinner as it gets out to sea, to depth, to keep it cheap and light, but it's quite thick as it gets closer to shore to protect it, especially from shipping activity, so like fishing, harboring, docking at the harbor, and so forth. Depending on the application and where exactly the cable is located at sea, it will have different types of layering and armoring. So you could have single layer armoring deeper at sea, and you could have double layer armoring closer to the shore. Now, the repeater is actually a bit of a misnomer from the days when you had to generally repeat a signal. That is to say, to capture it at the end, in the middle of its transport, regenerate it, and then send it off to the next hut. Nowadays, it's actually just a normal amplifier, a normal EDFA, erbium doped fiber amplifier. So we just use repeater in the subsea world just because it's a name that has stood the test of time, but it's actually an amplifier. Technically, it's not a repeater. These repeaters are built into the cable system itself. They are positioned anywhere from 60 to 100 kilometers, depending on the application. So either you're going for a high capacity system or you're going for a low cost system. They're normally encased in titanium to withstand pressure, corrosion, etc. Generally, if you're building a system that is unrepeated, which is normally less than 200 to 400 kilometers, you don't need a repeater, in which case it will just be the actual fiber itself without this kind of structure. The repeaters are what has made subsea possible because of the amplification. Without the amplification, it wouldn't be possible to build a subsea system. These systems can run, as long as 14,000 kilometers, and you can't do that without amplification. Then you've also got the branching unit. Now, the branching unit allows you to drop along the way. So say, for example, you want to build a system that's going to drop, let's say, Penang or Langkawi, or obviously down here at KL, drop in Singapore. But then we'll have an express that, say, goes from Penang to Singapore direct without a drop. The branching unit allows you to split the cable at a specific point so you can connect other landing stations to the system. The branching units are essentially just very expensive multiplexers that can either be passively or electrically operated. And as you can see in the picture here, for example, you've got the cable coming in on one end and then branching out, continuing to the location and then dropping off at a nearby landing station. The beach manhole is a concrete structure that dries out the cable, so to speak. So it provides the interface between the subsea component as well as the dry plant. The beach manhole is where you then take the cable, dry it out, and then interconnect it to the cable landing station. Every subsea system will have a beach manhole, and beach manholes can be shared between different types of cables depending on if the cables are landing at that facility as well. The cable landing station system itself, building itself, can either be a brick and mortar or it can be a stand-up solution. It's quite common nowadays to have prefabricated containers that have all the HVAC, ODF, power, etc., like the one you see on the top right, or you can pre-build an entire structure like you see on the left. And obviously in the inside, you've got all the equipment that's required to operate the cable itself. The PFE, which is the power feeding equipment, is what is used to drive electrical current, DC current, through the cable. Now, on terrestrial systems, you've got maybe 60 to 80 kilometers. You've got what we call an ILA, an intermediate line amplifier hut or a building. And the good thing with that is you have access to electricity and so on and so forth. In subsea, you don't have access to electricity along the cable route. So the power has to come from this cable landing station. The PFE is installed at either side of the point-to-point system, and both of the PFEs can actually pump power into the cable at either end. The PFEs are designed such that if one end of the PFE fails, the other one can take over the full load, which is quite nice because PFEs do fail, not so often, but they do fail sometimes. These can pull as much as 20 kVA, 25,000 volts, let's say, of DC into the system. And that's a lot of energy because you're going to have a lot of voltage drop at each amplification point. Like a typical 12,000 kilometer system can have as many as 100, 150 amplifiers, on the cable. The SLTE is essentially the optical system. In the old days, they were specialized. And since we moved to what is known as coherent detection in the optical space, I think Jeff touched on it before when he talked about how quickly transistors are developing, such that now we're at 3 nanometer chips, which you're using in your iPhone, but also into these devices that are able to provide, 1.6, 2.4 terabits of capacity on optical line cards. That's what we have the SLTEs now. From 2012, when coherent allowed us to fix chromatic dispersion in the mathematical domain, we now have what once used to be normal terrestrial optical vendors in this space as well. So Ciena, Infinera, Nokia, Xtera, Huawei are now providing this capability on the subsea side. The concept of open cables is one where you have a cable system that is operated by one supplier. So let's say Google, for example, but then they're able to lease different portions of the fiber pair system or spectrum to other operators. And each of those operators is able to run any SLTE vendor they want. So on a single cable, you could have multiple optical vendors. This is obviously where all the bandwidth is generated. Now, some of the practical issues that you will run into with subsea systems is that cable landing stations are not data centers. That's one of the most important ones. And it's not a problem today because new cables now extend from the landing station and into a carrier-neutral data center. So as early as 8 years ago, you could only buy capacity at the landing station. And that meant things like cross-connects were highly expensive. In some cases, they still are. In some economies, I know places where cross-connect costs you $15,000 for 100 gig. But now, new cable systems mandate that the SLTE, which provides the optical service, is landed in a carrier-neutral data center, which then leaves the PFE hut, or where the PFE sits, as the actual CLS itself. Normally, they aren't far from each other. 50 to 100 kilometers would be the average distance between the CLS and the open carrier data center. But you still do get some markets where they aren't running open cables that you'll have to pick up capacity in the landing station. And in that case, it can become quite, let's say, cumbersome because cable landing stations don't normally have the space to provide that kind of co-location facility. Subsea cables is the other practical issue. They do fail. And I think in Asia Pac specifically, I recall over the last 10, 15 years, there have been a number of massive failures around cable systems. On average, you'll have about 2 cuts, 1 to 2 cuts every year, let's say. That's normally how operators tend to account for the insurance for those things. Mobilizing ships and getting repairs out, taking weather into account, et cetera, can easily cost you 3 to 12 weeks on a good day. Sometimes it could be more. You might recall one of the outages in the Red Sea where some cables weren't repaired for almost 8 months. So things like that. Leasing vessels for repair can be about 100K a day on average. And by the time the repair is done, you're looking at anywhere from $1 to $2.5 million for a repair. So it is quite costly. That said, though, subsea systems are a lot more resilient and more reliable than terrestrial systems. So that's why, you know, when you have to spend this kind of money every 2 to 3 years, it sort of works itself out. The majority of subsea failures, though, happen due to anchoring as well as fishing activity. And no, not sabotage, deliberate sabotage, let's say. Shallow waters obviously are quite risky because you have a lot more human activity. A shunt fault is also a very common issue that actually afflicts cables more often than actual cable cuts. And a shunt fault is what happens when the protective layer of the cable is exposed and you've got the copper or the aluminum conductor with accessing the water that moves the virtual ground from an equidistant point between the PFUs to where the shunt fault is. So even if the shunt fault, say, moves closer, or the virtual ground moves closer to the shunt fault location, because the PFU, you remember, is able to send power from one end all the way, the cable can continue to work. It's not uncommon that shunt faults can last 4, 5, 6 years before they're actually repaired, because what people then tend to do, the operators, is that they wait for a bigger issue to occur, or they combine resources with maybe another ship that's going to be in the same area doing work. Because like I said, if you're paying 100K a day just to repair a shunt fault, you'll be spending money almost every month, because shunt faults are quite common. Yeah. And the subsea space is historically quite terrible at providing useful information to the public. So unless you're a direct customer, you probably generally wouldn't know what's happening with these issues. So if you wonder why subsea cables don't communicate so much, it's because historically there's always been some kind of secrecy around anything to do with subsea. In terms of resilience, even though subsea capacity is generally cheaper than terrestrial capacity, it's still expensive if you want to purchase it directly as an operator. Most people or most operators that have subsea capacity tend to buy it from an IP transit provider who either owns the cable or has interest in the cable itself. In much of the world now, and again, as Jeff highlighted, the rate of demand for capacity is outstripping you know, the available fiber, submarine fiber projects that are out there. We are getting to a crunch in most places around the world. And, you know, between the content providers, Google and friends, tying up a lot of infrastructure for cable production, ship mobilization, repairs, etc., there really isn't enough infrastructure to build cables as quickly as we need the capacity. So there's a possibility, at least in some markets, that prices will begin to creep up. You can take where I'm from, for example, on the African side, we just have a new cable called To Africa that's just launched on the east side and very soon on the west side. But because all the cables on the east side are end of life soon, we suspect that the price for To Africa is going to be higher than it should be lower, let's say. And until more cables come online, that will be the trend. If you look at Asia Pac as well, AAE1, Simiwi 5 have just run out of capacity. They're less than 10, 11, 12 years old. So the practical problem there is that we now have a fundamental difference between technological end of life and commercial end of life. The average commercial end of life now is anywhere from 7 to 10 years. That's not a long time. And if you consider that most cables today are able to do 150 to 250 terabits as a whole system, it's really mind-boggling how quickly we're running through capacity. And yes, Starlink could be an option, but Starlink is only, well, Starlink and all other satellites are only able to cover 1% of the actual requirement. So it's nowhere close to competing with satellite, with subsea. And at the moment, there's no other technology that I think can compete with subsea at the moment. I think RF radio tried in the 1930s, that didn't work. Satellite tried in the 1980s, that didn't work. So there's nothing yet that can compete with subsea from a scale standpoint. These projects are rather expensive, 100 million to 1 billion, let's say. Meta just announced a cable the other day, Project Waterworth, something or other. They're supposed to go around and form a big W around the world. That's easily going to be, I would say, $10 billion project when it's done. 50,000 kilometers. Maybe it will take 7 years, 8 years. So these aren't cheap projects at all. But some of the biggest issues that you get with these systems coming online is, permitting, regulatory, environmental impact. You do get people that want to protect some kind of wildlife, and that can cause delays, and those delays do cost money. So what is the future for growth and capacity on the subsea side? The biggest problem we face right now is we are very close to Shannon's limit, so how much usable capacity we can get out of the system. And the incremental or the marginal gain with every new generation of coherent DSP is only giving us anywhere from 3 to 6 to maybe 10% additional capacity, which isn't a lot. So we're now exploring ways to increase that capacity, and one of those ways to increase the fiber pair count, which has given rise to what is known as the SDM, spatial division multiplexing cables, where instead of the normal 6 to 8 fiber pairs, you now have 12 to 32, and maybe even up to 40 in the near future. The other thing that we're doing is looking at the combination of 2 bands, C and L, so C band and L band together to give us about, let's say, 10 terahertz of bandwidth. There's only one cable system, and it's actually only in Asia Pac. I think it is PLCN that is implementing C and L, but no other cable is doing it because it's expensive to do. You have to have C-band amplifiers and L-band amplifiers and C-band transponders and L-band transponders, and all of that just costs a lot more money. So C and L is viable on terrestrial, but in subsea, not yet. So what we're instead likely to see is advancement in the fiber cable core infrastructure. Now, NEC, for example, have begun deploying what is known as 2-core fiber, which means that in the core, you actually have 2 cores within 1 core, and that doubles your density for that core. Now, if you can have multiple cores within 1 core, and if you can have multi-mode, so when I say multi-mode, I don't mean multi-mode 850 nanometer, I mean the multi-mode of single mode. So you have multiple modes of single mode inside that core, which would be B, which is MCF, and then C, which is few mode fiber. If you combine those two, then you can essentially increase the capacity of the system. But this is still very, very early days. The majority of SDM cables will still maintain normal single mode, single core fiber. But we do expect to see more multi-core deployments in the next 10 years. And then the other wild one that the NICT community did in Japan was to test new minerals for amplification of all bands. So right now we use erbium as the mineral to amplify only C band and L band. But if you have these other minerals, you can amplify all the various bands from all the way down to. And when they did that test, they came up with about 378 terabits worth of capacity across 50 kilometers using a multitude of modulation schemes with as many as 1,500 wavelengths. So there's obviously some hope because 50 kilometers it's a respectable distance for this kind of technology. We just have to sort of size it down. So maybe I would say in about 10, 15 years, we could see this become viable, but there's at least one way to expand the capacity. Ultimately, there's just not enough capacity now if you extrapolate for the next 10 years with the amount of cable systems that are A, coming online, and B, that are also becoming end of life. That's it. Thank you.
Questions for Mark?
Hello. Hi, I'm Sergey Masaydov. Just 2 questions. First, are those risks of cable cuts, of undersea cable cuts, are covered in some way by the insurance companies? Is this the usual way to insure those risks?
Yeah, so network operators generally have an insurance budget, anywhere from 3 to 10 million or more, depending on the number of systems you want to insure. I'll be honest, some of them try to avoid those budgets because that could be the year where you don't have a cut, and it's great not to have that on the books. But generally speaking, yes, you would have insurance for those.
And second question. Last year, we have seen some unexpected cable cuts in the places where there weren't expected before, like a Baltic Sea, for example. On the other hand, there are places where the cable cuts are happened. Not every day, but like often. Do you think? There are rumors that it was intentional cable cut. Do you think those incidents will change market in any way?
So there's no concrete data to support that, the cable cuts that occurred in the Baltics was deliberate and sabotage. There's no concrete data to say. And I know it's a back and forth in the industry, but right now there's no hard evidence.
Well, I said rumors.
Yeah. Having said that, though, locating a cable is not easy work. Weather aside, renting a boat, knowing where to go, determining the right cable, pulling it up, and all of that stuff is actually not that easy. It's very specialized work that can generally not go unnoticed. This is one, but also just the actual physical process of doing that work is not easy. This is the kind of work where people die, let's say. So I wouldn't put any stock into that kind of information unless there's hard data to prove. Now, like the 2013 incident in Egypt where a bunch of people were seen actually cutting fiber towards the Med, sure, but those are very few and far between. Ultimately, natural seismic activity, underwater landslides, that sort of thing, fishing, that's where most of the cuts are happening. The rumors, I would leave them at that for now. There's just no hard data. It is sexy to think that, someone in Russia can go and do something, or someone in China can go and do something. It is sexy to talk about that, but there's no real data, no real hard evidence.
Thank you.
Sure.
John Brewer, New Zealand. Mark, when I buy terrestrial fiber optic cable, it's in 1, 2, or 5 kilometer drums, and we joint it. How long are the drums for submarine, and what happens with the jointing process?
What happens with the?
Jointing process.
So the typical, let's say, construction ship will have about close to 5,000 to 9,000 kilometers worth of cable in the drum, because they'll have multiple drums, maybe 3 or 4 drums, and each of those will be at least 2,000, 3,000 kilometers worth. That's just for construction. Obviously, for repair, the repair vessels will have less because you'll have to lay less cable. For the jointing, the jointing will occur typically on the ship itself. So once they get to the location, it depends if it's a repair or if it's a new build. But either way, the jointing will happen on the ship itself. Everything will be tested, nicely sealed up, and then closed up and then laid down. So that happens. There's a specialized clean room on the boat itself where the jointing and the resplicing, if it's a repair, happens specifically on the boat.
Okay, that's great. And one more, are there different types of ships that are used for unrepeated or festoon systems?
Yeah, just cheaper ones. Really, yeah, there's no amplification that needs to go down. Some of the armoring might not be as intense, so you would get just a cheaper, smaller ship. But the fundamental issue we have, especially for the larger repeated systems, is that there's no access to the ships at the moment. They're just all tied up by the projects Google and the rest are doing. So on average, you're looking at about 3 to 4 years to book a ship, and maybe another 1 or 2 years to get the cable manufactured. So the average lead time now to build a cable is anywhere from 5 to 8 years. It's pretty bad. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark, would you want to also talk about the panel that we have on Wednesday about this topic?
Yes, so we do have a panel Wednesday afternoon, I think. So there'll be a panel of John as well will be on the panel. So we'll be talking about the whole life cycle of subsea, from concept to commercialization, to contracting, to deployment, to maintenance, to decommissioning. So that will happen on Wednesday afternoon, among 5 or 6 people. All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. So next we have Justin Rabin, who's the CTO of Kentic, and he'll be talking about DDoS mitigation via BGP FlowSpec.
All right, thank you. As said, I'm Justin Ryburn, actually the field CTO with Kentic, which is slightly different, but get into the talk here real quick. A little bit about myself before I get started. I spent about 25 years in this industry, and at the beginning of my career, ran networks and had to go and chase down DDoS attacks. Never seemed to happen while I was in the office, always seemed to happen for some reason when I was trying to enjoy some time off or an evening out with the wife. So kind of why I became passionate about different methods and different ways that we could solve for this problem. So that's why I wanted to come talk a little bit more about BGP FlowSpec today. So before we get into that, just a few trends that that I see around DDoS. So yeah, it still is a problem. I mean, we're 25 years after I started in this industry and we started dealing with DDoS attacks on the internet, but you can see some articles here from late 2023, so maybe a couple of years old, but this problem is still going on. It's still something that network operators are faced with on a fairly regular basis, is having to track these attacks down and having to block these attacks. Another thing that we see is that cloud scrubbing is on the rise. And what I mean by cloud scrubbing, I'm talking about like a service that provides DDoS mitigation on your behalf, as opposed to having to buy scrubbing hardware and install it in your network. The scrubbing hardware is really expensive, and especially as you start to build out and scale your network, putting DDoS appliances inline in your network just becomes cost prohibitive to be able to build and grow and scale your network that way. And so what we're seeing is more and more companies are turning to a service to do DDoS mitigation for them. I'll talk a little bit about how they can do that, but that's a trend that we're starting to see in the industry. The other thing I do see every once in a while is people will kind of pick a route in the middle, which is instead of buying the hardware and putting it inline everywhere, they'll build a scrubbing center. So they'll have in maybe one data center in each theater, so maybe one in North America, one in EMEA, and one in APAC, where they scrub the traffic. And so as the traffic enters their network, they'll redirect it over to the scrubbing center, have the traffic cleaned, and then redirected back into the network. So here's an example of what that would look like on the internet. So you've got this company at the bottom there, on the bottom right, that's advertising a route. Normally AT&T, AS7018 is their upstream provider. That's who's providing them with their internet access. But once they were under attack, they started redirecting that traffic through Neustar. So they are doing a change to their BGP advertisement to advertise their route upstream instead of through AT&T to Neustar. And then, of course, that propagates out to the internet. So all of the traffic from the internet hitting that particular prefix there being routed through Neustar. Neustar is doing the scrubbing for them and then injecting the clean traffic back into their network. All right, so what are some other alternatives that we have for dealing with DDoS attacks beyond just BGP FlowSpec? So there are some other alternatives. This is probably the first way as an industry we started dealing with this 25 years ago, which is just a very manual process. So as you can see, the little enterprise data center there on the right side of the screen there is under attack. They call their friendly internet service provider that's upstream of them, say, hey, I'm under attack. Can you please do something about this? Can you please help me out there? And then hopefully, if you're lucky, someone from that service provider, from their network operations team or their security operations team goes and logs into all the devices and puts a firewall filter or an access list on all of their interfaces and stops that attack so that the victim can get back to work and get back to serving up their content. But there's some challenges with that approach, right? The first thing is that, well, I guess one of the benefits of that is that doing it with an ACL, doing it with a firewall is very granular, right? So you can get down to very granular details on what it is that you want to block as far as the traffic goes. But if you need that applied on all of your routers, on all of your interfaces, that's very time consuming and very error prone to go and do. So if you have somebody logging in manually, making those type of configuration changes to block an attack, the odds they're going to mess something up and cause an attack is pretty high. Trust me, I know because I've done it. And when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. You could automate that, of course, by you could automate that by doing a script that goes out and makes those changes for you, but then it goes wrong even faster. So I don't know if anyone here has ever removed a Cisco ACL without actually de-applying it from the interface, but what that does is it then default denies all the traffic, and if you go and run a script that does that across all of your peering routers, let's just say your network goes off the internet. So again, something I would know very much, having done that myself. So this is something that is very error prone, can cause the problem to get actually much worse, cause more problems than it actually solves if you're not really careful. One thing to note, there are now some vendors in their operating systems, the way their operating systems work, that do kind of the opposite of what I just described with Cisco, where you can have a blank ACL with no lines in it. And then as you have an attack, you can actually go in and add additional lines to that without having to go through and commit the change every time. So it kind of allows you to dynamically update the firewall filters and block that traffic, which is kind of handy for this particular way of doing things. So then as an industry, we evolved from what I just described to doing remote trigger black hole. And the idea behind a remote trigger black hole is instead of that victim having to call and ask somebody manually to install a firewall filter or an ACL on their device, they can just go ahead and advertise a BGP route upstream to their provider, usually with a special community on it that tells that provider, hey, when you receive this route, just redirect that traffic to discard or to null zero, depending on the particular router vendor that you're using. And then that can be dynamically propagated through the entire service provider's network. So all of their, not only will they protect their customer, but they won't even have to carry that attack traffic on their backbone. Traffic will actually be blocked at the edge of their network. So it's a pretty good way to dynamically deploy out a block or a mitigation for that DDoS attack. You know, this has been around since 2004. The RFC that described this was RFC 3882. It was ratified back in 2004. So the idea, the concept behind this is not something new. It's something that's been around for quite a while. Like I mentioned, you have the concept is that they're advertising a BGP prefix, usually as a /32 upstream to their provider, who then drops that traffic. But that requires going out to each one of the devices and doing a configuration in advance. So if I'm the service provider and I'm setting this service up that I'm going to offer to my customers, I have to have a particular IP address that I'm using as that discard to null zero or that discard to discard. And I have to set that up on each one of my devices. So that IP address has to be pre-configured on the device in order for this to work. And then the real downside for this, for that end user that's under attack, is it does what we call completing the attack, right? Sure, they're no longer getting the attack traffic into their network, but that particular /32, that one IP address that was previously under attack, is now no longer accessible, right? Because all traffic reaching, destined for that particular interface, that particular IP address is being discarded. So that IP address is effectively off the network. So I don't know how many of you have been following along, but there's a new protocol that's kind of part of the open config and streaming telemetry umbrella of things that are going on in the industry called gRibby. And the idea behind gRibby is to be able to directly inject routes, sort of like its own routing protocol, if you want to think of it that way, into a network. And so This potentially could offer some help when it comes to DDoS mitigation, because similar to a remote trigger black hole, I can go and inject a route into my network. So in the case of the diagram that I have here on the slide, the data center, the IP address that's under attack would then call their service provider. Their service provider would inject a GRIBI route, presumably through a route reflector, out to all of their routers and scrub that traffic at the edge of their network. So, the advantage is that we can use this protocol to send out dynamically to all of our devices what we want to be scrubbed, what we want to be blocked. It can also be used to redirect. So if a customer is doing a scrubbing center, like I mentioned earlier, where they have a particular data center to which they're redirecting their traffic and scrubbing in there, it can be used to do a redirect. But last I checked, there was no current way to get more granular and do a more granular match. So you have to take an entire, at least a single IP address or a block of IP addresses and either block it or reroute it. You can't say block it based on the size of a packet or the particular protocol further up the stack. All right, so now we'll get a little bit more into BGP flow spec itself. When the RFC was ratified, they added a new AFI and SAFI, a new network type for doing BGP flow spec advertisements. So for unicast traffic, it's AFI 1, SAFI 133. For VPN traffic, so if you're doing routes in a VRF table, for example, it's going to be AFI 1 and SAFI 134. In order for that to work, of course, both sides of the BGP session have to know that they're going to negotiate that capability. So if you go and turn this on, your BGP sessions are going to reboot so that they can negotiate that capability. If you're going to turn that on, make sure you do it in the maintenance window because your session is going to bounce. Or the other thing you can do, which what I typically recommend to my customers when we're talking about this, is just create a second session, right? Have one session for your normal routing and then create a second one for advertising these flow specs over. Once we've advertised or once we've got the protocols set up and BGP can now advertise these routes between each other, we need to create the actual route itself. So the NLRI in the route actually defines what the matching criteria are. And you can see there's a lot of granularity to what I can match on to. So I could look at things like destination and source prefixes. I can look at ports, protocols, ICMP type codes. So there's a lot of different things that you can match on to tell it what kind of traffic I want to match, what the parameters of the attack are that I'm trying to mitigate. The one thing I want to call out here is that there is a Type 4 does source or destination, but I find most times this is confusing to people. This isn't doing what they actually think it's doing. So what it'll actually do is it will, let's say that you advertise as Type 4 with a port of 53. If port 53 is in the source or port 53 is in the destination, either one, it's going to drop it. And that being kind of what I would call non-deterministic tends to get confusing. So I recommend people use either 5 or 6 so that you know whether you're wanting to catch the destination port or the source port. All right, once we've done our matching, then we have to decide what we want to do with that traffic. And so there's a few different actions that you can take against your traffic. These are actually attached to the BGP NLRI, to the BGP route as an extended community. And so, a few different things we can do here. We can do a traffic rate. So we could just rate limit the traffic. If you want to actually drop it, then you just set a rate limit to 0, which essentially does drop all of it. You can sample the traffic. You can redirect to a VRF, so you can add a route target to it. That could be really helpful if you're wanting to redirect it to a scrubbing center, put it inside of a VRF, send it to the traffic scrubbing center, and then let it redirect it into your global routing table. And then you could also do a DSCP marking. So maybe instead of dropping the attack traffic, you want to just mark it as discard eligible. So once you get congestion, that'll be the first traffic that gets dropped. But why do I like BGP flow spec? Why do I feel like this is better than some of the other methods that I walk through? the first thing is that it has a very similar granularity as that manual ACL that we started with, right? I can get down to things like ports and protocols, packet sizes. So there's a lot more granularity in what I can block. I can get a lot more surgical in blocking only the traffic that I want to block and allowing the legitimate traffic on through. It has very similar automation or similar dynamic nature that an RTBH does, where it can be advertised out without anybody having to log into every single one of those routers, without having to do any type of scripting on each one of the devices. And they can also leverage BGP best practices. So we already have, as an industry, pretty well established best practices and policies around advertising routes between various different AS numbers and even within an autonomous system. So we can leverage all of that policy and best practices that we've learned over the years. Now, it does have some drawbacks. It's not perfect like anything when it comes to networking. One of the things that I hear as a common complaint from customers is that kind of as a transmit only nature to the forwarding plane, meaning that there's no ACK method coming back from the forwarding plane saying, yes, I did receive that, and in fact, I have programmed it and am doing the enforcement that you asked me for. I was talking to a carrier recently that was saying one of the challenges that they have is they use BGP flow spec, block an attack. Somebody calls and complains that they're blocking the wrong thing, their operations center goes in and logs in, there's no access list applied. It's really difficult for them to know that the reason that that's being dropped is because of a BGP flow spec route that had been received and is then being forwarded into the forwarding plane. So it's kind of like a whole nother troubleshooting path for their operations team that they've got to train on. So it's one of the complaints that I hear about this. And then the other one is just the rule ordering. So you think about it like a firewall, or when you build an access control list, you have orders of rules, and it just walks through the order, and the first hit it gets, then it matches that and blocks based on that. The challenge with BGP flow spec, if you've got two rules and they're overlapping, you got to figure out what to do with that. And different vendors have different implementations on how they'll handle that. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, is how to handle that rule ordering. So what about adoption rates? We've had BGP flow spec now for a number of years. In fact, I think the last time I was at APRICOT, I talked about this same topic. It's been about 10 years ago. So, what do our adoption rates look like? So I went out to our friendly chat GPT and asked it for what it knew about how many organizations are using BGP flow spec. And while the answer was entertaining, didn't really give me much data. And that's actually really, I think, a challenge we have as an industry. It's really hard to get a handle on how many people actually are using this. It's similar to what Mark was talking about earlier on data around undersea cables and how they work. It's kind of a little bit secretive. Same thing with BGP flow spec. Other than me just anecdotally talking to people at trade shows and meetings and events like this one, there's not a lot of great research out there or a lot of public information. There's not that I'm aware of been any studies that have been done on how many people are actually running this. But I would say based on the number of conversations that I have around this topic, people telling me they're either testing it or they're running it in their production network, it is continuing to be talked about. It is continuing to be adopted. And you'll see in a minute, there is still work going on in the IETF to make it better, to try and address some of the downsides of BGP flow spec. So how about some best practices? If we're going to adopt this technology, let's see what we can do as far as learning from some of our mistakes, learning from things that other folks have done that didn't work out so well. One of the reasons that I think BGP flow spec gets a bad rap or gets kind of a negative impression is that in the early days when people started using the protocol, there were some pretty high profile outages. Right, so a couple of the more well-known ones, I think some of you may have heard about. In 2013, Cloudflare had a pretty major outage in their network, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And CenturyLink back in 2020 had I think it was a multi-day outage as a result of this. So, what can we take away from these outages? Right, I mean, they happen. The past is the past, but what can we as an industry learn from these incidents? And I think it comes down to a few things. Like anything else you're going to roll out and put into your production network, test, and test again. Make sure if you're going to use scripts that are going to announce BGP flow spec into your network, that you've done good testing of them, you've done good debugging of them. Like I mentioned, the Cloudflare outage on the previous slide, it turns out that the cause of that outage, you can go and read their public blog on their website. They were pretty forthcoming about the details of how that happened. But what they found out when they did the debrief on it was that they injected a BGP flow spec route into their network that said, please filter all packets that are from a size 99,971 to 99,985 bytes long. Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, that doesn't even make any sense. Even with jumbo frames, you could never have a packet that big. And that's the point, is that what actually happened was when, in this case, it was Juniper devices, doesn't really matter. When the Juniper devices received that BGP flow spec with a request to block those packets that were outside the bounds of what their code allowed for MTU, for packet sizes, caused the line cards to panic and reboot, right? So it caused an outage on their network. Now, we can argue that Juniper's router shouldn't react that way. I think they've actually since fixed that bug. But if Cloudflare had spent a little more time and had caught that bug before this went out, they could have also caught it that way. So anyway, point is, make sure you test and have good parameters around what you're doing. Test it at scale as well. I've had a number of people that I've talked to who would test it with like one flow spec against one attack just to make sure that it worked in a lab environment. It's hard to tell whether you're going to have resource exhaustion if you don't test it at scale. So the forwarding plane resources on any modern line card on any router are not infinite. They are a finite resource. And each flow spec route, once it gets programmed down to the forwarding plane, is going to use some of those resources. And at some point, you're going to run into resource exhaustion. You can ask your vendor what those resources are, but a lot of times when they test it unilaterally in a lab, right? So they may only test with, to see what the maximum number is that it can program in a very controlled environment. So I recommend, you do your own testing, find out what your particular line cards can handle at scale. And also consider doing redirect to a scrubbing center if forwarding plane exhaustion is your biggest concern. Because it turns out that actually uses less resources than a match and block in most line cards. Make sure you test all your different chipsets too. So if you have a mixed network environment where you have some older chipsets and some newer chipsets on your line cards in your network, make sure to test all of them because some of them may have different scaling parameters than other. Not all flow spec rules are created equal. So some rules, the more complex they get, the more resources they will take. So for example, if I just injected a flow spec route that said block this 1/32 destination prefix, that's a pretty simple rule. It's not going to take a lot of resources. If I get a lot more complex and say block this prefix, block this protocol, TCP flag, packet length, now I've got a much more complex rule. Which of course is the reason to do flow spec in the first place, but that is going to use more resources. So as you develop your best practices for your network, think about how many of those things you want to allow and then test that at that scale. Roll it out slowly, right? Like any other new thing that you're putting into your network, I always suggest to people that maybe they just test it in one market, right? So something goes wrong, you do limit the impact of that. So roll it out slowly, keep a close eye on your forwarding plane resources. If you've got either a show command or some sort of telemetry data that you can get from your device to find out what kind of resources each one of these is looking, so you can monitor that, make sure you don't have resource exhaustion. All right, so next steps. What are we as an industry, where do we go from here? I always recommend people to stay current on the latest advancements. There are a lot of active work going on still around this in the IETF's Interdomain Working Group, IDR working group. So there's a mailing alias out there. You can go and either join it yourself if you want to get it in your inbox. You can go out and read through the alias on their website, whichever's easier for you. But keep up on all the latest that's going on in the IETF as they continue to address some of the problems that I mentioned earlier. Use the hallway talk. So as you're at APRICOT, as you're at other events and you're talking to some of your other peers at other networks, talk to them about what they're doing. Learn from their experiences, learn from some of their best practices, what they've done, what's worked, maybe some mistakes they've made that you can benefit from, learn from, so you don't make the same mistakes. And always feel free to reach out to me. I don't know everything about FlowSpec, but I'm always happy to answer any questions that I might, or see if I can find you a resource who might know something I don't. Few additional resources. Those are QR codes if you want to follow them, or when we post the slides, these links will work. You can go out and check out some of these additional resources that are out here and available to you. So it's just a wrap up here, a quick summary. DDoS is still a challenge that we're facing as an industry. Mitigations can be difficult to do, but I believe BGP FlowSpec can be a big benefit to those who are using it. It is starting to pick up. There is some adoption, but there's still, I know a lot of companies that I talk to that are still a little nervous about turning it on, or haven't gotten around to testing it and rolling it out yet. But again, test it before you roll it out slowly, and then share your experiences, good or bad, with your peers so that we can learn from one another. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Any questions for Justin?
All right, I'll be around all week if somebody thinks of something afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for the shout out for FlowSpec V2. And now we have the last presentation. We have somebody from Malaysia, Muzammil Muhammad Azlan from Telecom Malaysia, who will be talking about their RPKI journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. Hello, my name is Muzammil, and I'll be sharing on the Telecom Malaysia RPKI deployment. But before I begin my presentation, I have a question. Does anybody know how many route hijack incidents which had happened within this year? Coffee on me. We have, I think, around 130 plus, and that's quite a lot, I would say. And most of the right, sounds better, right? Okay, so before I begin my presentation, I have a question. Does anybody know how many route hijack incidents which had happened within this year, just within this year? So in total, it's around 130 plus. Well, that's quite a lot, right? And most of the hijack, most of the incident can be mitigated using RPKI. So this is one of the reasons why we decided to pursue the RPKI. And we also wanted to build a more secure network for Telecom Malaysia. And for that solution, we wanted it to be automatically executed. And another thing is that we wanted to join the industry in reducing the route hijack incident. And because others are doing it, most of the top tier providers are dropping the invalids today. And to us, it's not about the revenue growth or anything like that. But to us, it's about doing the right thing. So let's have a look a little bit about the RPKI. So in RPKI, so we have two components, which is we have the ROA and we have the RPKI validators. So for the ROA, this is where we register our IP address with the proper subnet mask and with the correct origin. And on the other side is the validator. So validator is an open source tool which will allow us to download all the ROA and send it to our router to do all the automatic filtering. So a little bit technical, is it? So let's have a look at another slide. So let's take a ROA is the binding of our public IP with the origin ISP. And our passport is the binding of us individual with the country of origin. And without a valid passport, we would not be able to get far, right? We would be able still to get to Langkawi Island, but we'll not be able to get to Japan. And Japan has no. And I have another question. So how many passports can we have per individual? More than one. I saw that in the movie 007, James Bond. Well, this special part about the ROA. So we can have multiple ROA for a prefix. I'm going to share on this later. And let's go to the validator. So let's get to the airport. So at the airport, so we will have two options, whether we wanted to queue at the immigration officer booth, or we can get to the automatic gate. But either or, what's going to be validated over there is the passport, right? So this is where the validator comes into the picture. Validator will have the capability to download all the ROA and send it to the router, to the automatic gate for the automatic filtering. Quite interesting, right? Let's go next. So this is a little bit about how the logical flow of the ROA. So each of the ISP will register their ROA at the APRICOT repository, which contain the public IP, prefix link, and the origin ES. So the rest of the ISP will push their ROA over there at the APRICOT repository. And what's next? We can have the ROA being pulled into our network using a validator. So with all those information all together, what we can do with it, we can push it to our router using RTR protocol, and our router will react as the automatic gate, the one that we have at the airport, and we can do all the filtering based on what you wanted to configure. If it's valid, accept it. If it's invalid, drop it. If it's unknown, so it's up to you guys how you wanted to filter that. And a little bit about the ROA. So how do we check, how do we ensure that our ROA, the one that we registered, is correct? So I would propose to use the APNIC dash. It has a lot of information over there. And it also has the routing hygiene information. So if you have more time, so please have a look at the dash information. And this is the current ROA take-up for Telekom Malaysia statistic. So we had been auditing from time to time, and our current stat is at 99%. And this is the other one on the right, is the one that I got from the APRICOT Monitor NIS. So in total, we have about 1 million internet routes today, and 50% of it is a valid route. And we still have like 40+%, which is unknown, yet to be registered. And we have less than 1% for the invalid route. So talking about the invalid route, so it could be coming from misconfiguration, or it could be intentionally hijacked. So these are the ones that we need to drop. And this is the current ROA statistic for Malaysia. I would say that we have a good number, 96%, and thank you to everyone who update their ROA. It makes our job easier. And this is among the validators that we can see today, we can download. So in total, I would say there is around like 10+ validator that we can play around, all are written using different language. Some have GUI, and some have CLI. So if you do have plan to use the validator letter, so install more than 3 to 4 and have it a go and see which one will match your requirement. And in telecom, so we have 2 validators being positioned into 2 separate data centers using 2 vCPU, 8 gig of RAM, 50 gig of storage, and 2 connection, one to the internet and one to the infra. But before I proceed further, right, so going back to the airport, so aside from the immigration officer that we can see as the authority over there, so we can see the policeman, fireman, so emergency response team, medical team, we have the pilot, steward, lovely stewardess. But where I'm going with this is that protecting the network, protecting the environment is not a single team job. Everyone have their own responsibility to ensure the network is safe. And even though the validator is part of the security filter that we have in our network, so we need to position the server well within our network, behind the firewall, and never neglect all the security features that we need to protect the server. And I can't tell you how the immigration database looks like because they wouldn't allow me to say it. But I can share with you how the RPKI works in our router. So in this example, we can see clearly on the validation state whether the route is valid or unverified, unknown, and even invalid. And in this example, the one that we have invalid is because it has a covering ROA which dictates that those routes are only allowed to be advertised by AS9976. But the one that is in the routing table today is coming from AS200. So this is the one that I mentioned about. It could be from misconfiguration, or it could be from potential hijack. So these are the ones that we need to drop and stop that propagation to the internet. All right, so let's have a look how the invalid protection works. So in this example, we have a user which is connected to AS4788W router, and in a normal day, he will use the online banking website, which is being hosted in AS3000, the green router. So if all are working good, so everyone is happy. But when we are talking about something related with money, reputation, so there will always be a bad actor or attacker which wanted to turn things upside down. And in this example, so what the attacker did was he built a server exactly like the one, the online banking website, which is hosted in the S3000, use the same IP address, and advertise those routes to the orange network, S2000. And from the blue router perspective, BGP best path installation, it will pick only one as the active route. And over here, the blue router saw that lower router AD, lower WAN IP, so it saw that the best path to get to that banking website is through the orange network, ES2000, to the attacker network. And once that happened, the attacker will have the information of the user, login, password, and he can do all the bad things. So, but with a proper update of the ROA and then the validator, now the router, the blue router can know that the authorized origin of the routes should be only coming from AS3000, not AS2000. So automatically the blue router will drop the routes coming from AS2000 for the attacker route. And with this, we can protect our user from being rerouted to the attacker network. The attacker route will stay with there inside the orange network, but still, as I mentioned, that automatically the blue router will not accept those routes. So this is a part of the protection mechanism that RPKI can help us. Okay, this is the current global RPKI attack. So I got this information from Qaeda website, but the one that I have is up till 2020. So I did tweak a little bit to cover the one that we have to cover the one to include telecom, because we finished our dropping the invalids last year and hope the Qaeda team will mind I'll delete this afterwards. But we can see from here that started in 2017 and from 2018, 2019, started to grow. So many of the top tier providers are dropping the invalids, major RX are dropping the invalids, cloud provider, and even our local RX is dropping the invalid today. And if we were to have a look, if you were to look, Amazon is dropping it, Google is dropping it, Entity is dropping it. But one thing to notice is that for the United States, their routing security roadmap, the new one, which dictate that all of the government agencies are required to update their ROA, and all the contracted ISP will require to drop the invalids route. So those are the big things happening over there, and it's a good thing. And we're glad that we managed to cover ours. We finished everything last year. And remember the first question that I asked about how many route hijack happening around the world today. So I got this information from BGP Stream, BGP Watch, and Cloudflare Radar. So it got a lot of information sharing on who's the victim, and who triggered that, so the duration. And some even have the graphical view about where the traffic being rerouted to. So it has a lot of information over there. So this is one of the incidents which happened in Telecom Malaysia back in 2022. So Telecom was using the Akamai routes for our CDN content. And at the same time, SPT Telecom could be accidentally advertised the same routes toward the internet. But luckily for us, at that time, Akamai registered 2 ROA, which say that only Telecom Malaysia and Akamai are authorized to advertise this IP address. So the one that being advertised out by SPT will be tagged as invalid. And fortunately for us, Telstra are dropping the invalid. So the routes coming from SPT will not be able to get far. And we even didn't notice any case or any complaints. And I only bumped into this when I was looking at the BGP stream, and I saw that Telecom Malaysia was one of the victims. So, and looking into details, now I know why. So this is why the importance of updating the ROA and have the ISP dropping the invalid route. It can protect the incident like this. And this is one of the incidents back in 2021. But for this incident, it does impact our user. So at that time, we have Campana. I think they are trying to mitigate the advertisement toward Twitter, try to contain within their region, and accidentally advertise those prefix out. And from our router perspective, we saw that the best path to get to Twitter is not directly to Twitter, but sending it to Campana and accidentally pushing the packet to Campana and being black hole over there. And it took us a while to manually go into all the RX configure and dropping those routes from Campana. We managed to stop those attacks, not attack, but we managed to recover back all the reachability, but it cost us time. And this is one of the incidents which the team need to figure out what is the best solution for us. It needs to be done automatically because there's no changes from our side which trigger this incident. So, and based on this, we saw that at that time, only APRICOT would be able to stop this attack. This sort of routing behavior, I would say. Okay, and one thing to emphasize, APRICOT can protect from most of the route hijack, but not the route leak. But I do believe there is a working group which are looking at that. And I think it will be discussed among the conference session later. So I'm not going to go into detail on that. Okay, let's go to the challenges in APRICOT deployment. Not exactly a challenges, but things that we need to take care first, which is new setup, new awareness. I mean to say that before we wanted to deploy the APRICOT, so we need to have the same view among our team. So it's about why we need to have the APRICOT, what benefit can it bring us, what is the configuration changes that will impact our node. So how to troubleshoot it later. And then in terms of the firmware, so since there are certain firmware which are able to enable APRICOT, for some require firmware upgrade, and for some require a patch. And talking about multi-vendors, so we are looking at quite a lot like how it works, the CLI, how to configure this, how to verify. So it's going to be a little bit challenging for the rest of the team to make sure that everything works fine. And then talking about the timer. So we're talking about the validator to the router. So if it's involved protocol, it will involve hello, keep alive timer. And working with different vendor, so you know that the numbers ain't going to be the same, right? But I'm going to cover on this in the next slide. And this is among the test cases which we use to validate the validator. Like we tried to drop one validator and see what happened, bring down two, and we even bring down all the validators, and because we wanted to see what happened, will it impact our router, and what configuration changes that we require to drop the invalid, how to troubleshoot. But our major challenges at that time was not doing the test case, but managing those routers. Like, do you have friends which are capable, fluently able to configure all the major 4 vendors altogether? If yes, please take good care of him. If no, then we have a trick for that. So if you don't know how to configure router B from vendor B, the trick is ask the person next to you. But if that guy doesn't know, ask the other guy next to him. But if nobody in the room know how to configure that, well, that's a problem, right? But still, we have Google. But this is only in the lab portion. Going into the production, we have all the document ready to verify, to configure, to troubleshoot. Okay, so this is the one that I mentioned about the validator to the router. Validator to the router will use the RTR protocol, which is APRICOT to router. And working with multiple vendors, now you can see that, I would say default is not default anymore, right? So the numbers are different. But coming back to our objective, so why we wanted to deploy APRICOT is not to standardize vendor configuration. We wanted to drop the invalid. So as long as they can drop the invalid, we can work in between. Okay, this is our deployment timeline. It took us a while to deploy the APRICOT, starting from the awareness, approval, go in the lab, preparing the documentation, pilot test, something wrong, go back into the lab, retest again, go back to the pilot, push the policy, another awareness, telling others that we are dropping the invalids. And then we finished everything by last year in June 2024. So success story, we managed to push our IROV statistic for Telecom Malaysia from 0 to 99%. And last year, I noticed that at that time in the map, only Malaysia have, I would say, different color compared to others. But looking back 2 weeks ago, I saw that Myanmar is picking up, Indonesia is picking up. But remember that this is not a race. This is not about who has a better number or who has a better color. It's about doing the right thing. And from our execution, we saw that we are able to push Malaysia statistic from 1 to 2% up to 30%. And we're glad that we are able to spike up Malaysia statistic to 30% and contribute to the nation. And for the rest of the 70%, I'll leave it up to you guys and I'll say thank you upfront. And well, what's next for us is that finishing everything, so we celebrate. Malaysian style, we eat. And delivering the APRICOT in telecom is not a single man job. It's not a team, but it's a whole bunch of the engineers. Really, I would say a respectful engineer that make it happen in telecom. And we also managed to get the GCO award for that project. And we are happy with it. And before I end my presentation, I have one more question. So today, nowadays we talk about SDN, we talk about AI, talk about quantum compute, talk about all the new technologies, right? But do you have in your network people which are looking at what you have today? Is there any room for improvement? So if yes, then it's good. But if no, then you might consider, because considering current attack pattern, it's not targeting all the new technology, it's targeting what we have today. So this shall end my presentation. Thank you. Quite fast.
Any questions? There's one question in the chat which says,
All right.
can an attacker pretend to have a peering with the original AS? Attacker, let's take an example. Attacker 200 tells, AS 200 tells, he has a peering with AS 300, which was actually the original source, and is just forwarding the prefix. Does he get through RPKI check and receive the traffic? I kind of told that no, RPKI check will fail, but if you want to expand on it.
Okay. So another thing is that when talking about RPKI, it's not a foolproof solution. It's not a bulletproof solution. So, but coming back to the question, well, RPKI, dropping the invalids will be on the first router that you get on the ISP. So as I mentioned earlier, even RX are dropping the invalid today. So depending on the raw updates of the origin, if it's being properly enabled, so and the RX are dropping the invalids, for sure, it will be dropped over there. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question.
Wait for Fabrice to.
All right.
Okay. Is there any questions? Go ahead.
My name is Romi from Indonesia.
Okay.
Okay. So I do some tests in my thesis for the IPKI. So when I do the test that I found out some using the full mesh in the BG protocol that it will increase the number of traffic. That is first thing. The second thing that I found out that the monitoring. So when you first sentence how many prefix that will be hijacked, we cannot do the monitoring on the real time. So what is your suggestion to do monitoring real time when there's a prefix that been hijacking our route? Thank you.
Okay, so for this first question, let me get it right. Because when you are saying that, in a way, like introducing the RPKI in the network will, in a way, spike up the CPU for the router, is it? Okay, in our case, based on what we tested and what we deploy, we didn't see any spike when we connected the validators and everything. But we did bump into one issue where there is one router which, in a way, act quite weird because he was requesting the updated packet from the from the route reflector every time that it received the routes from the validator, from the validator session. So, but this is due to the bug, and we detect this in the production. So, from my side, I would say that execute a proper testing. And when we do the testing, do not only check on the router, check on the neighboring router, our route reflector. And I believe that if we were to work together with the vendors, they ought to we'll tell you earlier about any bugs or anything which relate to that. And for question number 2, about monitoring on the traffic for the hijack traffic. So from our side, when we do the filtering, so we are expecting those routes that have been hijacked will automatically being dropped. So we are not monitoring that. But information for that, if there's any incident or hijack happening around the world. So there is the website that I shared earlier, the 3-1. So it has a lot of information like who's the victim, duration of the attack, and have like the traffic flow GUI running, you can see when it trigger, where it being rerouted to. So I think information, any hijack, I think will be detected over there.
There is, in fact, a lot of online resources. Manners has an observatory, BGP stream. There are various online resources where you will be able to find that easily. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for a great presentation. And thanks for sharing your journey with us about APRICOT.
That's right.
And this was our last presentation. Just one announcement. We heard various talks that included a lot of protocols and work that has been done in ITF. We have a panel that we are organizing tomorrow morning. We have 2 area directors, and I'm on the Internet Architecture Board as well, who are here. And we would want to see more participation from our region, more participation from operators from our region. So come and talk to us, and we'll look forward to have some more discussion in that. This is tomorrow morning, first panel session. And enjoy the social today. Thank you.